We are at the Liberty Comics and Books in Concord, New Hampshire, and we're here for a book signing session with the world-famous author Sam Blumenfeld. Sam has authored over 12 books. He's got his most recent book in his hand. He'll be doing an autograph session here, talking about the book Revolution by Education and Alphaphonics and his Alphaphonics kit.
Well, the books that I have to offer here would be very helpful to parents who want to know what's going on in the public schools and would like to do something about it in their own homes. Revolution via Education describes how we got into this mess, how the public schools have become socialistically oriented. Because it turns out that early in the last century, the public schools were taken over by the progressives. And the aim of the progressives was to change America from a capitalist, individualistic society into a socialist, collectivist society. And the one thing they hated most was individualism. And our Constitution, of course, is based on the idea that this is a nation of individuals. Because if you read the Declaration of Independence, it says, we are all created equal, and we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that's a very individualistic view of an American, that we believe in individual rights, we believe in property rights, we believe that we own our own bodies, for example, which is one of the reasons why we had a civil war, because there was this debate, you know, it said all men are created equal. Well, it doesn't mean that we are all alike. It means that we were created as equally as individuals who can pursue happiness and can do whatever we want in our lives to pursue our various careers. And the progressives objected to that because they believed in a communist view of things where there is no such thing as private property. Well, of course, that was the reason why we had a civil war, is because the Southerners considered the slaves to be property. But of course, the most important form of private property is your own self. You own yourself. This is your property, and you use your property as a means to earn a living, as a means to become successful in any enterprise that you want. And so the Southerners had this peculiar view that since slaves were property, that therefore that the slave owner was protected by property rights. But he was stealing somebody else's property, because in order to have become a slave, somebody had to kidnap you. Somebody had to deprive you of your private property. And so the Constitution of the United States and the Declaration are very clear on the idea of individual rights and self-ownership. And I explain a good deal of how the minds of our educators were changed to leave the idea of individual rights and individualism and to espouse this idea of the collectivist state, which is a fairly, well, there have always been groups that have favored a form of community property, communism, and they've never succeeded because it's so totally against human nature. We are individuals, and we have to be treated as individuals, and our Constitution treats us as individuals, and that's why the Constitution has been such an obstacle to socialism, because they cannot create socialism constitutionally. So the only way they can do it is to disregard the Constitution and to impose socialism from the top down, which is what is now happening in Washington, where you have Obama, who is a socialist, and we know that he's a socialist because he was also a community organizer. And in order to become a community organizer, you must be a radical revolutionary of the left. That's the qualifications to become a community organizer. You must be a radical leftist revolutionary. And it was Saul Alinsky, the revolutionary in Chicago, who wrote a book, Rules for Radicals, in which he said that the only way that the socialists can take over America is to do it by stealth. You must never say you're a socialist, and you must never say that you're a communist. You must say that you're a progressive or a Democrat. But you must never, never use the word socialist or communist.
Or Republican.
Yeah, because when, for example, when Obama was interviewed by one of the major, talk show, not talk show, but the news people, the anchor people, and they asked him, he was asked, "Are you a socialist?" And he said, "Well, people call me all kinds of things." And then he got away from the whole question, you see. In other words, people call him a socialist, but he doesn't call himself a socialist, because even Alinsky refused to label himself socialist or communist.
Sam, the reading problem in our schools, deliberate or what would you say about?
Yes, about the reading problem. Well, the reading problem was created by these socialists because they wanted to get away from individualism. And our form of teaching reading, the phonics method, creates individualists, people who can read for themselves and don't need somebody else to tell them what they've read or how to believe or how to think. So they said the only way we can really create socialism in this country was to get rid of that individualistic form of reading instruction. So that's when they began to use the look-say method, the whole word method, which would dumb down the population, dumb down the Americans, turn them into poor readers so that they would be dependent on the socialist elite to lead them. And I became aware of the reading problem back in the 1960s when I was an editor at Grosset and Dunlap in New York, and a friend of mine came to my office and asked me to become a member of the Reading Reform Foundation, to become a member of the National Advisory Group of the Reading Reform Foundation. So I asked him, well, what is the purpose of the Reading Reform Foundation? And he said, well, it's to get phonics back in the schools. Well, I looked at him, what do you mean get phonics back in the schools? Since when was it taken out? How can you learn to read without phonics? And so he advised me to read Rudolf Flesch's book, Why Johnny Can't Read, which was published in 1955. And I read that book, and of course, Flesch explained exactly why Johnny couldn't read. It was because they weren't teaching him to read in the proper phonetic manner. They were using this whole word method, which is generally known as the Dick and Jane method. And of course that has evolved into the whole language method, which is even worse than the Dick and Jane method. And so when I heard that, that's when I became aware of the reading problem, and so I wrote a book on the subject entitled The New Illiterates. And in that book, because I exposed how the look-say method originated, it originated as a means of teaching the deaf to read. See, the deaf can't hear sounds, so they can't hear the, they can't they can't see, they can't hear the letters, the sounds of the letters, and so Reverend Gallaudet, in his school in the 1830s in Hartford, his school for the deaf and dumb, taught children to read by juxtaposing pictures and words. So you had a picture of a cat and the word cat, and the child would associate both, you see. And try to look, when they saw the word C-A-T, they would think of a cat. They wouldn't be able to read the letters as k, at, t. They would look at a whole word, cat, and see a picture of the cat. In fact, there was a wonderful article on in the Washington Post about how accuracy is not the name of the game. And the writer said that if a child sees the word horse, H-O-R-S-E, and says pony, that's correct, because the child is seeing the picture. Of course, if a child looks at the word H-O-R-S-E and says pony, he can't read. Let's face it, you know, he's guessing. But that's what the educators have been doing. And so after I wrote The New Illiterates, I decided to provide parents with a means of being able to teach their child to read at home in a simple and easy way as possible, with as little instruction as possible. And so I created the Alphaphonics book. And there are no pictures in this book because you don't want the child to guess. They have to know the letters and the sounds. I teach the entire alphabetic system. You know, we have 26 letters. But how many sounds do we have in English? Do you know how many sounds?
40-something. 44.
44. Yeah, the head of the Samuel L. Blumenfeld Literacy Foundation, he knows that there are 44 sounds. Well, if you're going to teach an alphabetic system that has 26 letters and 44 sounds, you have to do it in a very careful way, which is what I do. I teach each letter sound, each spelling form in different lessons, and in 128 lessons a child learns to read.
You've taught adults who have been raised on Luxay how to read properly too.
Right,
Sam.
right. Yes, I have tutored adults, high schoolers, college students, because they have been taught to read by the whole language or the whole word method, and they become a sight reader. And so in order for them to become a good phonetic reader, you have to break these habits that they've acquired. And it's very easy to tell if a child is a phonics reader or a sight reader. First of all, a phonics reader loves to read. And they'll read anything, they'll read Dickens, they'll read anything you give them. They love books. The sight reader hates to read, hates books, because it's so difficult. And if you ask them to read aloud, they will leave out words that are there, they will put in words that aren't there, they will misread words, they will guess at words, they will truncate words. For example, if the word says newspaper, they'll say paper. If the word says telephone, they'll say phone, that sort of thing. And so you can tell a sight reader very easily, no big problem. But it's the schools that create these problems. Because if you teach a child to look at each word as a little picture, well, how do you look at a picture at a museum? Do you look at it from left to right or right to left? No, you look at the picture and you're attracted to something in the middle of the picture that gets your attention, you see. And so the child who is taught to read by the whole language method has to devise a technique whereby he tries to figure out what the word says, even though he doesn't know the sounds of the letters, you know, whereby he would be able to sound out the word. A child who is taught to read with phonics can take a multisyllabic pharmaceutical term and break it up into syllables and read it, you know. And that's how they read. Whereas a sight reader, if confronted with a multisyllabic word, we'll look for little sight words within the big word, and we'll try to guess it on that basis.
Now, Sam, you conclude that what's happening in our public schools is happening by design, that this isn't just ignorance, that it's by design. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, everything that goes on in the public schools is by design. There are no accidents in our public schools. Everything, if you have ever, you know, I used to subscribe to Education Week. And every week they would have a list of the different conferences and seminars, educational conferences and seminars taking place all over the United States. And everything in education is thoroughly discussed by the powers that be. Those who control the colleges of education, the deans, the presidents of the colleges, those who control the National Education Association, all of those people who are in control of the system make sure that what goes on in the public school is controlled. That is why I can't get this book into the public schools. Now, you might get an isolated teacher who understands what's phonics. Like I have a teacher down in Texas who became aware of the reading problem and of alpha phonics. He was teaching in a private school, and then he went into teaching special education in the public schools, and found that alpha phonics was tremendously good in teaching these kids with these reading problems how to read. And so I know that it works because I've had the testimony of people who have used the alpha phonics book. So any parent, all they have to do is read the instructions in the back and they can teach their child to read. They don't have to take a course in the subject. They don't have to get certified. They can do it at home very easily. And I wrote a specific